Hello and welcome back for another VMK in the game development series. In this bonus VMK, we're going to go and change the mechanism for which we keep track of the game state. And let me show you why we're going to need to do this. We currently have the following setup where we have the start of the program goes here, we go into game state starting, this is our splash screen, and then we go into our game state menu. This is basically the starting point where you can then choose if you want to change some options or choose to start playing the game. And then depending on the choices we make, we could traverse through this tree here following any of these arrows. Now in the next VMK, what we're going to do is add a new state to this sort of structure here. However, this state will need to be accessed from both the game state options screen as well as from the game state pause options screen. So we'll need to be able to go in here into this new state and also come back. Same thing over here. We'll be able to go in and out. However, with the way that we've arranged our mechanism to move between states, we won't know when we press the back button inside of this state here whether we should be going back to this option or back to the pause option. To fix this, or to actually improve upon the way that we navigate through our menu system, what we're going to do is scrap the method we're using right now and implement a stack. And the stack is going to be responsible for keeping track of the current game state as well as all the previous game states that we've traversed through. Let me show you how this is going to work. Our stack is just going to be a standard vector that is going to contain game states. And at the very beginning, what we're going to do is we're going to fill this stack with two values. The first item that we're going to place inside the stack is going to be a game state menu. And the second one is going to be game state starting. Like so. Now, anytime we want to know what is the current state of the game, we'll always look at the very last item inside of the stack. So in this case, it's going to be game state starting, which is this guy here. So when we start, we're going to have game state starting. Now, when we traverse through this tree, we're going to give it a unique direction. And what this means is, anytime we are moving towards the game state menu, we're going to be popping things off of this stack here. So we're going to be moving upward in this diagram. However, if we're moving away from this game state menu, we're going to be pushing things into this stack. So in other words, what we're going to have is a direction that sort of looks like this. If we're moving in this direction, in the direction of the arrow, we're going to be putting stuff into the stack. And if we're moving in the opposite direction, or against the arrow, we're going to be popping from the stack. So now we can see here, because we're starting here and we're going into the game state starting, which is the first one, because we're moving against the arrow, we're going to be popping. So we're going to pop this guy off, and then we're only going to have game state menu inside of the container. Now from here, anytime we go, let's say we go into our game state options. If we go into here, we're going to push game state options onto the stack. So let me write that in here, game state options. And then if we were to go to this other state here, then we're going to push that state on there as well, game state whatever. Now, when we press the back button, we're going to be popping. So as soon as we pop, we're going to go back to the game state that we came from. So this guy's going to disappear and we're going to be back in options, and then when we click the back button, we're going to be popping again, so we're going to be back to the menu. And if we're going this way, then we're going to be pushing game state loading, we're going to push game state play, we're going to push game state pause, we're going to push game state pause options, and then we're going to push this guy here. Now when we press the back button, it's going to know to return to here because that's the previous value that's stored inside of the stack. So the stack has a way of knowing the previous history that we've gone through so that when we're pressing back, we know where to go back to. The only other thing we need to worry about is this state transition here, when we go from our pause state back to the game state menu. Let me just erase all of this. And let me write in the states that we'll have stored inside of this stack here. So we'll have game state menu, we'll have loading, we'll have play, we'll have pause, and when we're in pause, we're going to be here. Now, if we press the exit game button, we don't want to push anything onto the stack, or we don't want to pop anything off of the stack, because if we pop, we're going to go back into the play state, which is not where we want to be. And if we push, then we're going to be inside game state menu over here. But that's not what we want either. So for this transition here, it's going to be a special case, and what it's going to do is it's going to actually erase everything inside of this container, leaving only game state menu. Then we're going to be back inside of our root state, which has only game state menu at the very first location inside of the stack. So this is the structure that we're going to be implementing, and the functionality is going to allow us to then add this extra state here in the next VMK, which we'll be able to access from both game state options and game state pause options. So let's go into the code and start implementing this now. Okay, so here we are in the code. We're going to need to change quite a few things to make this work, so let's just start off with game OpenGL. In here, if we take a look inside of the frame function, you'll see that this is where we make some decisions based on the current game state. And currently we have this variable here called game state previous as well as game state now. And anytime we want to know what the current value of the game state is, we use this variable here, game state now, because this contains the current state of the game. Well, we're going to need to remove these and replace them with our stack. So down inside of the header file, let's just locate where we've defined these guys. And I'm just going to comment them out. Well, actually, we might as well just delete them altogether. We won't need them anymore. We're now replacing those two variables with this std vector, which is a vector of game states. And we're also going to add in this Boolean variable called bStateChange. And this variable here is going to be responsible for telling us when we've changed states from one state to another. Now let's go and compile our code to see everything that got influenced by our removing of those member variables. Inside of the constructor, we were initializing the values that we wanted for those member variables. We're going to replace these now with the initializations of our stack as well as that Boolean variable. And as I said before, we're going to initialize our stack to have two items inside of it. First item is going to be game state menu, and the second item is going to be game state starting. And we're also going to initialize the state change variable to be true, because this is going to cause some code inside of the frame function to tell us that we're basically starting the game. So let's save this, and let's take a look at the next error in here. Oh yes, inside PUser settings, we're setting some pointers that allowed us to change the game state from within our scene class. Now what I'm going to do is actually going to remove this set pointer function from PUser settings and allow our scene class to directly access our game OpenGL class. This way, we'll be able to get the game state as well as the frames per second and the game time directly from the game OpenGL class rather than having to go through PUser settings. This will just give us a more clear route to the data that we need. So let's comment this out or remove it altogether. And just so that I don't forget a little bit later on, what I'm going to do is go inside user settings here and remove this function definition right here. We'll come back into this class in a minute to make some changes in here as well. All right, back over here inside game OpenGL, we have this guy here. Here we're looking to see if we've pressed the escape key, and if we have pressed the escape key and the current game state is play, then we want to change the game state to be pause. Well, our new mechanism has to have an ability to get the current game state so that we can check to see what it is, as well as we need a mechanism to change the state of the game similar to what we're doing here. To do this, I'm going to go inside of gameOpenGL.h and underneath the start message loop, we're going to add the following functions. I'm going to have function here called getGameState that's going to return to us the current game state. And notice that I'm making this guy inline. I'm doing this because this function called getGameState is probably going to get called quite a bit every time we go through our loop. So I want to make it inline just so that it's a little bit faster. The other function is called changeState, and this is the function we're going to be using anytime we want to push items or pop items from our history stack, which means we can go down here and remove this state change function because we're no longer going to be using it. So let's save this and go back into our code. Where were we? Right here. So here we're checking to see what is the current game state. Well, now we can use our new function, getGameState, and we don't pass in any arguments. It's just going to return to us the current state of our game. If we are pressing the escape key and we are in the play state, then we want to change the state of our game. So we're going to call changeState here, and we're going to pass in GameStatePause because that's what we want. All right, scrolling through here, let's see. Here we have, if we're in the play state and we don't have the console open, then we do some actions down here. Well, again, we're going to have to replace this with getGameState. And down here, there's another check. This is inside of the start message loop. We also have to change this code here because to bypass the introductory screen now, we don't want to cause a game state menu to be pushed onto the stack. Instead, we just want to pop the previous value that's already stored on the stack. And the way we do that is we just call changeState, but we don't pass in any variable. You'll notice that by default, I've set it up here that the game state that gets passed in is GameState none. And inside of our changeState function, what we're going to do is know that if it's GameState none is passed in, that means we want to pop values from our stack rather than pushing values onto it. Okay, next guy here. Okay, we're inside a frame, and here we're checking to see if the current state value is different from our previous state. If it is, we're changing the previous one to be the current one, and then we're resetting the time. This is where we're going to use that new variable that we just created that tells us whether we've changed states or not. So if this guy is true, we're going to change the time change value to be equal to 0, and then we're going to reset our state change value to be false so that we don't go into here a second time. The only time that this guy's going to get triggered to be true from now on is any time that we change states using our changeState function call. And that we still have to implement. But let's continue on with all these other changes here. This guy's been changed. This guy's gone. This guy's gone. All right. Here, we're inside of the frame function call, and we're deciding what to do based on the current state of the game. Again, we're going to use that new function call that we're going to be creating called getGameState, and the return value is going to be the current game state of the game. So based on the return value here, we're going to go into the appropriate case statement. And let's see what else we have here. Okay, if we lose focus, we want to check to see if we're inside of the play state, so we need to change this. And our function call now is going to be called changeState. Down here, we've gotten rid of this function altogether, so we can just go and delete it. And I think that should be it for our game OpenGL class. Let's go and try recompiling it just to see if that fixed all the errors. Okay, we've missed a few state change function calls here. So we need to go in and re-implement the methodology for how these work. This guy here is inside of the initialize function, which was responsible for setting the initial starting state of our game. Well, we've changed this now so that the game state underscore starting state of the game is inside of our constructor rather than our initialize function. So this guy here is no longer needed. We can just delete him. This state change here says that we want to change to be GameStatePlay after we finish showing the intro screen. Well, that's odd. This is an oversight on my part. This guy should have been saying GameStateMenu all along. Same thing with this guy here. However, for some reason I've overlooked this, but we can fix this now. Instead of going into the play state from the intro screen, we want to go into the menu state. And the way we do that is we're going to be popping the value off of the history stack. So we're not going to be passing in any variables into the change state. Same thing down here. So let's save that. And one more. This guy here is after we're in the loading states. So what's happening is we've gone inside loading. Once we finish loading everything, we want to go into GameStatePlay. Well, now we do want to push GameStatePlay onto the stack because if we go into here, we want to be able to return back to GameStatePlay. So to do that, we're just going to change this function call to be changeState, and we're passing in GameState_play. Okay, that should be all the changes we need to make. Let's try to recompile again. This time it's successful, which is good. Okay, now let's go in and actually implement this changeState function. Where did I put it? I put it underneath start message loop, so let's find where start message loop is and put it right underneath it. We're passing in a game state into the change state function, and by default in here we've already specified that if we don't specify anything into this parameter, then we're going to be using game state none. So if the state is game state none, then we want to be popping back from our game state history stack. The first thing we do is we check to make sure that there's something inside of the stack, which means that the size of this stack should be greater than 1. And if this is true, then we can go and call popback, and then we can also save that the state change is equal to true because we are switching states. If this is false here, then we don't do anything because this is sort of an error state where we've been asked to do something that we can't really do. So we don't actually do anything, we just return. Now, if the state that gets passed in here is not game state none, then that means we want to push something onto the stack. But there's the special condition we need to take care of, and that is when we're going from game state pause back to game state menu. We know this is going to be happening anytime we're pushing game state menu into this change state function. If that's the case, we automatically clear everything in the state history by calling the clear function on our std container, and this is going to erase everything that's inside of our history. Then we go in and add the current state that was passed into here. So we're going to be pushing game state menu back onto the game state history stack. We also change this Boolean variable to be true to let us know that state transition has occurred. If we're pushing something other than game state menu, then we don't clear this history, but we do push it onto our history stack. And we also change the state to be true here as well. So that's what this function does. It's pretty simple and hopefully very easy to understand now that we've seen how our stack works here inside of PaintShop Pro. The other function that we added is our inline function called getGameState. Because it's inline, we have to define it inside of our header file, so I'm just going to scroll down here to the very bottom and add it down here. This function is only responsible for returning the current state of the game that's stored inside of our history. So to do that, we don't want to be pulling things out of the container and removing them. We just want to take a look to see what is located at the very last element inside of our history stack. To do that, we can call this back function, which returns to us the very last item inside of our stack. So we get that item, we return it, and that's all that function does. So let's save this guy. And okay, that's it for the game OpenGL class for now. We're going to come back and make a few more modifications in a minute. But let's go in and take a look at some other things we need to change. You'll remember that down here we removed that function which was inside of user settings that let us set some pointers. And let me see if I can find it now. Here it is here, set pointers. We removed it because we're no longer going to need to go through our user settings class to get to the current game time as well as the frames per second or the game state. We needed these because our scene class needed to know this information, so we're going through the user settings class. We're going to change this so that our scene class will be able to go directly into our game OpenGL class and pull this information when it needs it. So let's go in and delete this function here. And because we're deleting that guy, we can go into the header file and scroll down to the member variables. Where are they? Right here. These are the 3 pointers that we're getting set by that function. We're going to remove them now from our user settings class because we don't want our scene class to go through it to get to those variables. We're going to make the scene class go directly into the game OpenGL class. Let's go in and compile user settings to make sure that we didn't influence anything else. Looks like we did. Okay, we have get game time as well as I think there's another one which is get frames per second right down below. These 2 functions are now going to get moved inside of game OpenGL. So let's just copy these guys because the information still needs to get passed to our scene class, but the information is now not going to go through our user settings. So back inside of game OpenGL, I'm going to put it right at the very bottom underneath the get game state. Now because we're adding these guys here, we're going to need to go into our header file and add the following. Get game time and get frames per second are the 2 functions we're going to be adding, and we're going to need to copy this because down here we're going to be adding in the following. So we have get game time. Let's make sure I got the case sensitivity correct. And when we're getting the game time, our variable that we need to access is this guy here, m_d time game. So we're going to be returning him after we cast it to a float because we're returning a floating point number. The other one here, get frames per second. Let's just copy him. And we got get frames per second. And the member variable for him is, I think it's m_fps. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. So we're just going to return him. And he's already a floating point number, so we don't need to cast him. We can just return him directly like so. Okay, so we've moved those functions out of our user settings class and put them inside of our game OpenGL class. Let's try recompiling. Oh, there's this other function here, get game state. We've already put him inside of game OpenGL, so we can remove him from user settings. Let's go and try to compile him. See what else we forgot. We no longer need the set game state because all the setting is going to happen through game OpenGL, so we can delete him. And looks like user settings is fine now. Okay, now let's go in and modify our scene class. Starting off with the header file, as I've been saying all along, we're now going to be able to access our game OpenGL class directly from within our scene class. So to allow for that, we need to add a member variable, which is going to be a pointer to our game OpenGL class. Now I just call it m_p game OpenGL. You'll notice that inside of the constructor for our scene, we already pass in a pointer to our game OpenGL class. So now we're going to actually be saving this pointer value inside of that member variable. So let's go inside of the constructor. And right here at the very top, I'm going to take the variable and just equate it to whatever's passed in here. And if I scroll down here, you see that I use the pGame OpenGL pointer to get the puser settings value. So let's just take this guy and move him to the top. You don't have to do this, but I just do it because it's a little more obvious where I use my variable inside my code. So I have the pointer value gets stored into our member variable, and then the pointer to a P user settings gets stored in here as well at the same time. Okay. So now we have access to our GameOpenGL class directly from within our scene. We don't have to go through our P user settings to get any values that we require. So if we compile this guy, we should get a bunch of errors because it's still trying to use the old system. Well, we need to go in here and change this now to be using the new system of changing the states as well as handling anything we need to handle properly. Inside of our player action function call, if we want to perform a jump operation, we need to know the current time of the game. Well, now we're going to replace this guy with pGameOpenGL, and we just created that function called getGameTime. So now we're going to be calling it. Now, we might as well copy this code because we're going to be using it down here for crouching and down here for standing up. Okay, it looks like over here inside of the render intro, we need to know the current game time. So we're going to return that. Down here inside of, still inside of render intro, a little bit further down, we need to know the current game time as well as over here and over here. Let's take a look here. What else? Still inside render intro, right at the very end, we have another check for the current game time. Over here, we want to know what is the current frames per second that we're getting. So right at the very end here, we want to replace this with a function call to get frames per second. Here, we want to know what is the current state of the game. Now we need to use our MP GameOpenGL get game state, and here we want to get the game time. And just going through here, working our way and fixing all these references. Okay, here we're inside of the GUI render function, and we're going to be using the current game state to decide which GUI elements to render to the screen. I'm going to simplify this a little bit by defining a variable right here at the very top. It's going to be an integer, which is going to contain the current game state of the game. Now notice one thing here. Game state is an enumeration which contains that either game state play, game state pause, all these different kinds of names. However, an enumeration inside C++ is really an integer. So what I can do is take the value that gets returned from our getGameState function call and save it as an integer. Then, by using this integer, I can reference whatever I need as if it's enumeration. So here we're going to replace this. Here we're going to replace the same thing, and so on. So we can just work our way through here. Anytime we wanted to know the current game state, we'll just use iGUI instead. This will make our code a little bit more readable and less long. Okay, save that. Let's go and recompile. 14 errors to fix. Inside GUI check hotspots, we're doing the same thing where we were getting the game state, saving it inside of this integer value. However, now we need to change this to be using mp game OpenGL get game state. Okay, and then in here, this is where we're transitioning from one state to another based on the input from the GUI. So here we need to do a little bit of extra thinking to make sure we don't mess up our stack as we're moving between states. So let's take a look here. We've pressed the main button to start the game, which means that we want to go into game state loading. If we go back into here, that tells me that we were in the menu and we're going into game state loading, which means we want to push game state loading onto the stack. We can do that by typing mp game OpenGL, and we want to change the state to be game state loading. Okay, let's take a look at the next guy. We have the main menu button options pressed. If we look at here, if we're inside menu and we press the option button, we want to push to go inside of game state options. So we're going to replace this guy with same thing, change state to be game state options. Next guy, we're inside game state options and we press the back button. Well, when we press the back button, we always want to pull from the stack, so we're not going to be passing anything inside of this function call. Next, we have the pause button continue. If that's the case, what's happening is we're inside of the pause option and we've pressed the button to allow us to continue to go back inside of game state play. And according to the arrow that I drew here, because we're not going into the direction that the arrow is pointing, we're going backwards, we actually want to be popping from our stack. So this one also we want to replace with null parameter being passed into here. This one here, pause button option is being pressed, and we want to go into the pause options. So that tells me that we are inside of the pause state and we want to go into options. So we want to push that onto our stack. Let's take this and replace it with the following. This one here, pause button exit, and we're going back into our menu. What that means is we're inside of the pause state and we've pressed the button to cause it to exit the game and go back into the game state menu. Now this is the one special case that we want to handle by clearing our stack of state changes. So to do that, we need to pass in game state menu into this function and it will automatically clear our history stack for us. This one here, pause options back button is pressed. Anytime the back button is being pressed, we want to retrieve the previous value inside of the stack. So we do that by not passing any parameter into here. And down in here we have GUI release mouse. And again, what I'm going to do here is just create that temporary integer variable, which we'll then use in here to make our code just a little bit cleaner to read. Down here, we fixed that guy already. All right, let's go and compile the scene.cpp, and he seems to be fine. All right, let's build a project to see if everything's been fixed now. Everything seems to compile fine and build. So let's go and try running our code. If everything works accordingly, then we know that our functions that we've changed have been changed correctly. So we can go back. We're back inside the options menu. Just go back and forth a few times. If nothing's crashing, that means the program is working properly. Cannot open some resources, that's fine. I probably just deleted the file that we asked to load. We're inside of the game. Let's press escape. We're inside the pause options menu. So if we go back to continue, we should be back inside the play state, which we are. If we go into the pause options, which is in here, that's correct. We go back, we're inside here, that's fine. And we can exit to the main menu. And now if we go and start up a new game, again it's asking for the model which you can't find, moving around, and alright. Well, looks like we're able to make those changes and everything seems to be working fine. We're able to navigate back and forth and throughout all of our game menus. We won't see the real effect of what we've done, which is by allowing us to go into the one game state from many different options and being able to return back from the way we came. That won't come into effect until we finish the next VMK, where we'll implement this new game state. So come back for the next VMK where we're going to go and do that.